She braced for the teeth of a monster, but the ferocious growl echoing in the shadows came from a muddy, trembling cub. What this desperate Omega didn't know was that saving this tiny wolf would drag her into the deadliest royal pack betrayal of the century. Stick around for this. Autumn winds gnawed at the exposed stones of St. Jude's Abbey, sweeping through the dense, unforgiving tree line that bordered the contested territories of Lorraine. Bridget Collins knelt in the damp, freezing loam, her raw, dirt-caked fingers digging meticulously around the fragile roots of a rare blood fern. In the brutal, militaristic hierarchy of the Oakhaven Pack, an Omega was afforded no luxuries, no warmth, and certainly no protection. Her survival depended entirely on her utility to the higher-ranking wolves. If she returned to the village without a full basket of medicinal herbs, she would not eat. It was a cold, absolute mathematics of survival that governed her every waking moment in the feudal society of 1461. Bridget's lineage had not always been relegated to the dirt. The Collinses were once respected betas, proud and fiercely loyal. But during the bloody Hastings Rebellion 2 decades prior, her father, Lord Thomas Collins, had backed the wrong faction. The wrong. When the dust settled, her family was stripped of their titles, their lands seized, and their descendants cursed to serve as the lowest rung of the pack hierarchy. Bridget had grown up with the stinging reality of this demotion. She was accustomed to the shoved shoulders, the stolen rations, and the mocking sneers of wolves who were less than half the warrior her father had been. Yet she endured. She kept her head down, her scent masked with crushed pine needles, and her mouth shut. The forest was eerily quiet this afternoon. The usual chatter of woodland birds had ceased, replaced by a suffocating stillness that made the hairs on the back of Bridget's neck stand upright. She paused, the silver-tipped harvesting knife trembling slightly in her grip. As an Omega, her senses were not as acute as a hunter's, but she possessed an ingrained, primal instinct for danger. Something was out there. Then she heard it. It was a low, vibrating growl that seemed to emanate from the very roots of the ancient oak trees. It was a sound designed to terrify, to establish dominance, to warn away trespassers. Bridget froze, her breath hitching in her throat. Her mind raced through the terrifying possibilities. A rogue wolf, driven mad by the approaching winter starvation? A scouting party from the rival House of Weaver, known for their ruthless border patrols? She slowly lowered her woven basket, her fingers tightening around the meager handle of her dagger. It was a pitiful weapon against a fully grown lycanthrope, but she refused to die cowering in the mud. The growl sounded again, closer this time, echoing from behind a massive, overturned hollow log draped in decaying ivy. It sounded strange, forced, almost rhythmic, lacking the deep, chest-rattling resonance of a mature alpha. Bridget swallowed her fear, taking a cautious, silent step toward the log. She parted the frost-kissed ferns with the tip of her blade, bracing herself to look into the glowing, violent eyes of a monster. Instead, she found a monster no larger than a loaf of bread. Huddled beneath the rotting wood, shivering violently against the biting wind, was a wolf cub. His midnight black fur was matted with thick, frozen mud, dried blood, and thorny burrs. But what struck Bridget was not his pitiful state. It was his posture. The tiny creature had puffed his chest out as far as it would go, his little legs braced in a wide, wobbly stance. He bared his needle-like milk teeth at her, his throat vibrating as he forced out another ragged, desperate growl. He was terrified, freezing, and utterly alone, yet he was practicing to sound brave. Bridget's heart, hardened by years of abuse, fractured in an instant. She lowered her knife, sinking to her knees in the damp soil. "Shh," she whispered, her voice a soft, melodic contrast to the howling wind. "I am not going to hurt you, little one." The cub's growl faltered, turning into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. He took a stumbling step backward, hitting the back of the log. As he moved, the dim afternoon light caught a glint of metal around his neck. Bridget gasped, her eyes widening in sheer panic. Snug around the cub's throat was a heavy collar of spun silver, meticulously engraved with a rearing direwolf against a crescent moon. It was the ancestral crest of the House of Weaver, the ruling family of the Northern Territories, the very pack that Oakhaven had been at war with for a decade. The pieces fell into place with terrifying speed. Whispers had spread through the scullery just days ago. Rumors that Lady Genevieve Weaver's royal caravan had been ambushed near the border by unknown assailants. The Northern Alpha had supposedly lost his mate and his only heir in the slaughter. Yet here, shivering in the mud, trying to roar like a king, was the lost prince of the North, Arthur Weaver. If anyone in Oakhaven found him, they would slaughter him to permanently cripple the Weaver bloodline. If Bridget helped him, she would be executed for high treason. She looked down at the tiny, shivering heir who had finally dropped his brave facade and was now whimpering softly, staring up at her with large, golden eyes that held entirely too much understanding. She had a choice to make: walk away and preserve her own miserable life, or risk everything for the enemy's child. Bridget unclasped her heavy woolen shawl. Without a word, she reached into the hollow log, scooped the muddy royal cub into her arms, and wrapped him tightly in the fabric. The cub immediately buried his cold, wet nose into the crook of her neck, letting out a soft sigh as her body heat enveloped him. "You're coming with me, little prince," she murmured, securing him against her chest and covering him with her apron. "But you must practice your silence now, not your bravery." Smuggling a werewolf cub across a militarized border and into a hostile village was an act of absolute madness. Bridget knew this with every agonizing, calculated step she took toward the towering wooden palisades of Oakhaven. The iron-reinforced gates loomed in the fading evening light, flanked by heavy braziers that cast long, flickering shadows over the mud-rutted road. Under the heavy fabric of her shawl, Arthur was remarkably still, though Bridget could feel his tiny heart hammering furiously against her ribs. To make matters worse, the checkpoint was being manned by none other than Captain Henrik Foley. Henrik was a beta of the worst sort, a cruel, opportunistic man who compensated for his lack of true alpha power by terrorizing those beneath him. He had a particular disdain for Bridget, constantly reminding her of her family's disgraced status. As Bridget joined the line of returning foragers and laborers, she pulled her hood down low, praying to the moon goddess that Henrik would be distracted by the tax collections. "Basket. Now, Omega," Henrik barked as Bridget finally reached the front of the line. His voice was a grating sneer, thick with arrogance. He was flanked by two burly enforcers, their hands resting lazily on the hilts of their broadswords. Bridget kept her gaze fixed on the muddy tips of Henrik's boots, submissively offering her woven basket with one hand, while the other clamped firmly over the bundle at her chest. "Valerian root, Captain, and some blood fern, as requested." Henrik didn't even look at the herbs. He kicked the basket out of her hand. The fragile roots and carefully harvested leaves scattered into the filthy mud. Bridget gasped, her shoulders tensing, but she forced herself to remain still. Clumsy, Henrik mocked, stepping closer. He leaned in, his nose twitching. A wolf's sense of smell was difficult to deceive, and Henrik was practically pressing his face into her personal space. You smell strange, Collins. Like wet dog and copper. What are you hiding under that filthy rag? Nothing, Captain, Bridget lied smoothly, though a cold sweat broke out across her spine. I fell in the briar patch near St. Jude's. I am bleeding, and the damp— Liar, Henrik spat, his hand shooting out to grab the edge of her shawl. Before he could tear the fabric away, a deafening blast from an iron war horn shattered the evening air. The sound was so immense, so commanding, that the very earth beneath their feet seemed to tremble. Henrik froze, whipping his head toward the southern road. The villagers in the courtyard instantly dropped to their knees in a wave of forced submission. Emerging from the fog of the southern tree line was a procession that made the blood drain from Henrik's face. Leading a column of heavily armored cavalry was a massive, scarred warhorse. Atop the beast sat Lord Alaric Weaver. Known throughout the realm as the Scourge of Lorraine, Alaric was a towering, terrifying figure. He was the brother of the reigning Northern Alpha, a battle-hardened commander returning from a brutal 3-year campaign in the Eastern Crusades. He wore a heavy cloak made from the pelt of a monstrous bear, his broad shoulders draped in black iron armor. His face was a landscape of harsh angles and lethal intent, bisected by a jagged silver scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. Alaric had diverted his army to Oakhaven under a flag of truce, demanding an audience regarding the recent ambushes. The sheer, suffocating pressure of his alpha aura washed over the courtyard like a tidal wave. Even Henrik, a beta of Oakhaven, was forced to avert his eyes and bare his neck in instinctual submission. Alaric reined his warhorse to a halt merely 10 paces from where Bridget stood. He did not look at Henrik. His piercing, icy blue eyes scanned the terrified peasants. But as the wind shifted, blowing from Bridget toward the imposing commander, Alaric's entire demeanor changed. The terrifying alpha stiffened. His nostrils flared. With terrifying, predatory speed, he vaulted off his horse, his heavy boots slamming into the mud. He bypassed Henrik entirely, his gaze locking onto Bridget with the intensity of a predator who had just found a missing piece of its soul. "You!" Alaric rumbled, his voice a deep, gravelly bass that made the timbers of the gate rattle. He closed the distance in 3 massive strides, stopping inches from the trembling Omega. "That scent. You reek of the royal bloodline. You smell of my kin." Henrik, seeing an opportunity to curry favor and shift blame, immediately drew his sword and pointed it at Bridget. "My Lord Weaver, this wretched Omega was just caught trying to smuggle contraband. She is a thief, a liar, and if she has harmed your kin, I will execute her myself." Bridget squeezed her eyes shut. This was it. She was caught between a cruel beta and a lethal alpha. She prepared for the killing blow. But Arthur had other plans. Feeling the aggressive shift in the air and hearing Henrik's threatening shout, the tiny cub decided he had done enough hiding. With a sudden, forceful squirm, Arthur wrestled his way out of the heavy shawl. He hit the muddy ground with a soft thump. The entire courtyard went dead silent. Lord Alaric Weaver, the deadliest warlord in the continent, stared in utter shock at the filthy, tiny ball of fluff that was his supposedly murdered nephew. Arthur did not run to his massive uncle. Instead, the tiny cub planted himself firmly in front of Bridget's boots. He puffed his little chest out, the silver weaver collar gleaming in the torchlight. He bared his milk teeth, locked eyes with the towering, heavily armored Alaric, and let out the fiercest, most desperate growl he could muster. The heir of the northern pack was protecting an Oakhaven Omega. Alaric slowly lowered his gaze, the shock in his icy eyes melting into something profoundly complex as he looked from the fiercely protective cub to the terrified, beautiful Omega, who had clearly saved his life. He raised a massive, gauntleted hand, pointing a single finger at the trembling Henrik. "Sheathe your steel, Beta," Alaric commanded, his voice deadly quiet. "Before I sever the hand that dares to point a blade at the woman my nephew has claimed under his protection." Silence stretched over the muddy courtyard, so profound that the crackling of the pitch torches sounded like snapping bones. Captain Henrik's sword clattered onto the cobblestones, slipping from his suddenly nerveless fingers. He fell to his knees, exposing his throat in an exaggerated display of terror, desperately hoping to appease the towering northern warlord. Lord Alaric Weaver did not even grant the snivelling Beta a second glance. His icy, scarred visage remained fixed entirely on Brigid and the tiny, defiant ball of black fur standing protectively over her boots. Arthur let out one final, strained huff of breath before his brave facade crumbled. The exertion of the growl, combined with the freezing temperature, caught up to the traumatized cub. His little legs buckled, and he collapsed into the cold mud. Before Alaric could move, Brigid acted on pure instinct. Disregarding the lethal alpha standing mere inches away, she threw herself forward, scooping the shivering prince back into the warmth of her woolen shawl. She cradled him tightly against her chest, her dirt-stained fingers gently rubbing his ears to soothe him. It was a brazen display of unauthorized contact with royal blood, an offense that normally warranted a flogging in Oakhaven. "Forgive him, my lord," Brigid whispered, keeping her eyes respectfully lowered. Her voice shook, but she refused to back down. "He has endured terrors no child should witness. He is freezing, starving, and requires immediate shelter." Alaric stepped closer, his massive shadow completely engulfing her. Brigid braced herself for a reprimand, or worse, the forceful seizure of the child. Instead, she felt the agonizingly slow, deliberate brush of heavy, leather-clad fingers against her chin. Alaric gently but firmly tilted her head up, forcing her to meet his piercing blue eyes. Up close, the jagged scar across his face made him look undeniably dangerous. Yet the expression in his eyes was one of profound shock mixed with a burning, undeniable curiosity. "You protected him," Alaric rumbled, his deep voice vibrating in the hollow of her chest. "An Omega of Oakhaven risked her own life to smuggle a weaver across enemy lines. Why?" "Because he was cold, my lord," Brigid answered simply, her amber eyes locked with his. "And because wars should be fought by warriors, not inflicted upon children." A flicker of profound respect passed through Alaric's cold gaze. Before he could respond, the heavy oak doors of the central keep slammed open. Alpha Gideon Cross, the ruling lord of Oakhaven, strode out onto the balcony, flanked by his elite guard. Gideon was a sharply dressed, calculating man, whose smile never quite reached his eyes. He quickly assessed the courtyard. His captain on his knees, the notorious scourge of Lorraine, dismounted, and a lowly, dirt-covered Omega holding a weaver cub. "Lord Alaric," Gideon called out, his voice dripping with false camaraderie. "What a surprise to find you gracing our humble gates. And what is this? The lost prince? Praised be the moon goddess. Please bring the boy inside at once. My healers will tend to him, and he shall be my honored ward until we can negotiate his safe return to the north." Alaric's jaw clenched. The air around him suddenly crackled with a suffocating, oppressive dominance. Every wolf in the courtyard, save for Brigid, was forced to avert their gaze. Alaric saw right through Gideon's hospitable veneer. If Arthur entered that keep as a ward, he would instantly become a political hostage. Oakhaven would use the boy to extort lands, resources, and brutal concessions from the grieving northern pack. "That will not be necessary, Alpha Cross," Alaric projected, his voice echoing like thunder against the stone walls. "My nephew has already chosen his sanctuary." Gideon frowned, gripping the wooden railing of the balcony. "I do not understand, Alaric. He is a child. He needs the protection of an Alpha's hearth." "He needs the protection of the one who saved his life," Alaric corrected coldly. He turned his imposing frame slightly, placing himself firmly between Brigid and the Alpha's balcony. It was an unmistakable, deeply instinctual posture of defense. "By the ancient laws of the lycanthropic accord, I invoke the right of the chosen guardian. This woman is now under the sovereign protection of the House of Weaver. She, and she alone, will tend to the prince." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered villagers. The right of the chosen guardian was an archaic, sacred law, untouched for centuries. It elevated a savior to the status of untouchable nobility until the debt of life was repaid. Gideon's face flushed with poorly concealed rage. An Omega, a disgraced Collins no less, was suddenly removed from his jurisdiction and placed under the banner of his greatest enemy. "She is an Omega of my pack," Gideon ground out, his polite facade cracking. "A lowly herb gatherer. She is unfit to nurse a royal heir." "She is the only one here with an ounce of honor," Alaric countered fiercely. He looked down at Brigid, his expression softening marginally. "Come, guardian. You will show my men where you reside. The prince requires rest." Brigid was entirely numb as Alaric's elite cavalry dismounted, forming an impenetrable ring of steel and muscle around her. She, an outcast who had been spat upon mere hours ago, was now being escorted like a queen. As she led the heavily armed procession toward her drafty, miserable shack on the edge of the village, she caught the murderous glare of Captain Henrik. He was still kneeling in the mud, humiliated, but his eyes promised a violent, bloody revenge. Night settled over Oakhaven like a suffocating shroud. Brigid's cramped, dilapidated shack had been entirely transformed. Alaric's men had brought in heavy furs, a roaring brazier, and a feast of roasted venison that smelled so divine it made Brigid's stomach ache. Arthur, bathed and fed, was currently snoring softly in the center of Brigid's sagging cot, buried under a mountain of northern wolf pelts. Brigid sat near the hearth, carefully grinding dried valerian root in her stone mortar. Across the small, cramped room sat Alaric. The massive warlord looked entirely out of place in her humble dwelling. He had removed his heavy iron armor, wearing only a thick linen tunic that clung to his broad, heavily scarred chest. He was meticulously sharpening his broadsword, though his icy blue eyes rarely left Brigid. "Your hands," Alaric spoke suddenly, breaking the heavy silence. Brigid paused, instinctively curling her fingers inward. They were bruised, heavily calloused, and dotted with tiny infected cuts from harvesting thorny briars without leather gloves. "They are fine, my lord. Just the tools of my trade." Alaric set his whetstone down. He crossed the small room in 2 strides, crouching before her stool. To her absolute shock, he gently took her small, battered hands into his massive, calloused palms. He didn't speak with pity, but with a quiet, simmering anger directed at those who had mistreated her. "The Collinses were proud warriors. I fought your father at the Battle of the Red Ridge," Alaric murmured, his thumbs lightly tracing her bruised knuckles. He was a formidable beta. To see his daughter reduced to a starving thrall, it dishonors the entire species. Bridget's breath hitched. No one had spoken her father's name with respect in 20 years. A dangerous, fluttering warmth began to bloom in her chest, but she forcefully pushed it down. She was a pawn in a very dangerous political game. She could not afford to romanticize the scourge of Lorraine. "You should not be so kind to me, Lord Alaric," she warned softly, pulling her hands away, though she immediately missed his warmth. "Oakhaven will not let you leave with him tomorrow. Alpha Cross is a greedy man. He will find a way to trap you here." "Let him try," Alaric growled, a predatory grin touching his lips. "I brought 300 heavy cavalry. We will burn this village to the ash if they attempt to bar our path." Before Bridget could argue the logistics of a siege, a sudden, unnatural draft extinguished the hearth fire. The room plunged into near total darkness, illuminated only by the faint silver rays of the moon filtering through the cracked window pane. Alaric was on his feet in a fraction of a second, his broadsword gripped loosely in his right hand. He didn't make a sound, his body perfectly still, listening. Bridget's omega senses, specifically her sense of smell, flared. Amidst the scent of wood smoke and roasted meat, a sharp, bitter odor drifted beneath the cracks of her wooden door. Wolfsbane. "Assassins!" Bridget hissed, scrambling backward to place herself between the door and the sleeping Arthur. The wooden door practically exploded inward, splintering off its iron hinges. 3 massive wolves, fully shifted and foaming at the mouth, lunged into the cramped space. They were crazed, driven menace by the intoxicating, pain-numbing effects of the wolfsbane smeared on their muzzles. In a confined space, against 3 deranged lycanthropes, even a warrior of Alaric's caliber was at a severe disadvantage. Alaric met the first beast mid-air, driving his heavy pommel into the wolf's skull with a sickening crunch. But the second and third beasts bypassed him entirely. They weren't here for the warlord. They were here to finish the job they started at the border. They were here for Arthur. A massive grey wolf snapped its jaws at Bridget, its yellow eyes wide with chemically induced frenzy. It lunged, claws extended, aiming to tear right through her to get to the cot. Bridget didn't have a sword, but she had something far more insidious. Grabbing the heavy stone mortar from her table, she flung the freshly ground contents directly into the grey wolf's face. The fine, dusty mixture of dried blood fern and valerian root exploded in a cloud over the beast's snout. Blood fern, when inhaled rapidly, acted as an immediate, severe paralytic to a wolf's respiratory system. The grey beast inhaled the cloud, let out a choked, wet gargle, and collapsed at Bridget's feet, its muscles entirely seized. Alaric, having dispatched the first wolf, spun around just in time to see Bridget neutralizing a 200-pound killing machine with a handful of dust. A look of fierce, unadulterated admiration flashed across his scarred face. He grabbed the third wolf by the scruff of its neck, utilizing his overwhelming alpha strength to hurl the beast bodily through the shattered doorway and into the muddy street. The commotion had awakened the entire camp. Alaric's guards were already swarming the perimeter, torches blazing, shouting orders. Alaric pinned the thrashing third wolf to the mud beneath his heavy boot. He reached down, grabbing the beast by the jaw, and forced it to shift back into its human form. The bones cracked and realigned, revealing the bloodied, terrified face of Captain Henrik. "Well, well," Alaric sneered, his eyes burning with a lethal blue fire. He pressed the tip of his broadsword into the hollow of Henrik's throat. "The snivelling beta from the gate. Tell me, Henrik, was it your brilliant idea to ambush my sister-in-law's caravan, or are you just Gideon Cross's obedient little butcher?" Henrik spat blood onto Alaric's boot. "You think you can just march in here and take our leverage? Cross promised me a lordship if I secured the boy." Alaric didn't blink. With a swift, brutal motion, he brought the heavy hilt of his sword down against Henrik's temple, knocking the traitor unconscious. He stood up, wiping his blade on his thigh, his gaze shifting to the balcony of the central keep, where Alpha Gideon Cross was visibly panicking, realizing his covert assassination plot had spectacularly failed. Alaric turned back to the ruined doorway of the shack. Brigid was standing over the sleeping cub, her chest heaving, a small dagger gripped tightly in her trembling hand. She had held her ground. She had protected his blood. "Pack your things, Brigid Collins," Alaric commanded softly, the harsh edge of his voice melting away entirely as he looked at her. "My lord," Brigid asked, bewildered. "Where am I going?" "You are going north," Alaric declared, stepping over the threshold and gently taking the dagger from her trembling grip. He reached out, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his touch startlingly tender. "Oakhaven has broken the accord. By morning, my armies will hold Gideon Cross accountable. But you are no longer a slave to this wretched soil. You are the guardian of the prince," and he paused, his gaze dropping to her lips before meeting her eyes with a smoldering intensity. "And you belong with us." For the first time in 20 years, Brigid looked at the brutal, freezing world around her and did not feel afraid. She looked at the scarred, terrifying warlord who treated her like a queen, and she finally allowed herself to hope. The Omega of Oakhaven was dead. The Lady of the North was just beginning to rise. If this tale of betrayal, unexpected bonds, and medieval werewolf drama kept you on the edge of your seat, don't leave just yet. Hit that like button, share this video with your fellow romance and fantasy lovers, and make sure to subscribe to our channel. Ring the notification bell so you won't miss the thrilling continuation of Brigid and Alaric's story in the next parts. Your support helps us bring more epic, real-life inspired stories to life.